Wyoming Territory, 1872. The dust of redemption was a living thing. It rose in lazy golden plumes under the hooves of passing horses, settled like a fine shroud on every windowsill, and tasted of grit and distance on a man's tongue. Sheriff Caleb Blackwood knew its every mood. He knew the way it swirled like golden phantoms in the late afternoon sun, and the way it turned to a thick, clinging mud with the first drops of summer squall. It was as much a part of him as the callous skin of his hands or the quiet ache that lived behind his ribs, a permanent resident in the house of his heart. From the window of his office, the town stretched out before him, a single artery of a main street lined with raw lumber buildings that leaned into one another for support against the relentless wind. It was a town built on stubbornness, a place where survival was a daily negotiation with the land. Caleb's world was one of predictable rhythms. The sunrise that bled purple and rose over the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains. The clatter of the blacksmith's hammer. The low murmur of conversation from the saloon in the evenings. He had carved this life for himself out of the wreckage of another, a life of order and solitude. Attachments he had learned in the cruelest way possible were vulnerabilities. They were cracks in a man's armor, entry points for a grief so profound it could hollow a man out from the inside, leaving nothing but a shell. He had been hollowed out once. He would not allow it to happen again. His duty was to the town, to the abstract concept of law, not to the messy, unpredictable entanglements of people. He ran a hand over his jaw, the rasp of his stubble a familiar sound in the quiet office. The silver star pinned to his vest felt heavy today, a constant reminder of the promises he kept to strangers while the most important promises of his past had shattered like glass against stone. He thought of Sarah, of her laughter that sounded like wind chimes, and of little Jacob, whose small hand had fit so perfectly in his. The memories were ghosts, faded but still capable of casting long, cold shadows. He had buried them out on a small rise behind the ranch he no longer had the heart to run, buried them under a sky as vast and indifferent as God himself. He had come to redemption to forget, or at least to silence the echoes. And for 5 years he had succeeded. His world was small, contained, and safe. Then came the sound that always signaled a disruption. A long, mournful whistle that cut through the vast emptiness of the plains, growing from a distant cry to a thunderous roar. The afternoon train. It was the town's lifeline and its greatest variable, a steel serpent that spit out mail, supplies, and occasionally new souls who did not yet understand the unforgiving nature of this land. Caleb felt a familiar tightening in his gut. New people meant new problems. He preferred the problems he already knew, the predictable disputes over land or water, the occasional drunk to be hauled to a cell to sleep it off. He picked up his hat from the desk, the felt worn smooth by years of use, and settled it on his head. Duty called, and Caleb Blackwood always answered. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, the sudden glare of the sun making him squint. The entire town seemed to hold its breath as the locomotive chugged and hissed its way to a halt at the small depot. Steam billowed in great white clouds, momentarily obscuring the view. A few townspeople had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and practiced indifference. The station master, a wiry old man named Jebediah, bustled about with a clipboard, his movements jerky and efficient. Caleb leaned against a support post, his arms crossed over his chest, a silent observer. His gaze swept over the few passengers disembarking. A pair of drummers with their sample cases, a rancher returning from Cheyenne, and then her. She was the last one off the train, and she seemed to carry the east with her like a fragile perfume. Her dress was the color of summer sky, a deep blue that stood in stark contrast to the endless browns and grays of redemption. It was fine wool, clearly expensive, but now travel-worn and dusted with the grime of the journey. A matching hat with a small, netted veil was perched atop a cascade of honey-blonde hair that had been pinned with meticulous care. She moved with a grace that was utterly foreign to this place, her back straight, her chin held high, though Caleb could see the weariness in the set of her shoulders and the slight tremor in the gloved hand that clutched a small reticule. She stood on the platform, a solitary figure amidst the noise and steam, her gaze scanning the small crowd with an expression of hopeful anticipation. Caleb watched as that hope slowly began to curdle into uncertainty. Her eyes, wide and the color of moss after a rain, passed over the faces, searching for one that was not there. The drummers found their wagon. The rancher was greeted by his sons, and soon the platform began to empty, leaving her increasingly, starkly alone. The hopeful light in her eyes flickered and dimmed, replaced by a dawning anxiety that she tried, and failed, to conceal. Caleb pushed himself off the post. This was not his business. A stranded woman was a problem, and he avoided problems. Yet, he did not move away. He watched as the station master approached her, his tone audible even from a distance, a mixture of rough kindness and impatience. "Looking for someone, miss?" "Yes." Her voice was clear and cultured, a stark contrast to the local drawl. "I am. A Mr. Silas Croft. He was to meet me." "He is my fiancé." She said the word with a touch of defiance, as if daring the dusty air to challenge her. Jebediah scratched his head, his grizzled face wrinkled in thought. "Croft? Don't know the name. You sure this is the right place?" "This here is redemption. I am quite certain," she replied, her composure beginning to fray at the edges. She produced a letter from her reticule, the paper crisp and white against her dark glove. He wrote that he had secured a wonderful property just outside of town and a position for me as the new schoolteacher. Caleb's jaw tightened. There was no new schoolteacher position. Old Mistress Gable had been teaching the town's children for 20 years and had no plans to retire. And there was no large property transaction under the name Croft that he was aware of. A cold knot of suspicion formed in his stomach. He had seen this story before, in different forms. Hopeful women lured west by promises that turned to dust as soon as they arrived. He saw the exact moment her carefully constructed poise finally shattered. Jebediah shrugged, offered a gruff apology, and turned to supervise the unloading of the freight car. The woman was left standing beside her two large trunks. The train whistle blew its departure, and the great engine began to chug away, severing her last link to the world she knew. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Caleb saw not a refined lady from the east, but a lost and terrified girl, swallowed by a landscape too vast and empty for her to comprehend. Against every instinct that screamed at him to stay detached, to remain in his fortress of solitude, he found his feet moving. He walked toward her, the sound of his boots on the wooden platform a heavy, deliberate rhythm. He stopped a few feet away, keeping a respectful distance. He was a large man, and he knew his presence could be intimidating. He tipped his hat. "Mom!" She startled, her head snapping up. Her eyes were wide, and he saw fear in them, but also a flicker of something else, pride. She would not be seen as a victim. She straightened her spine, a small, defiant gesture. "Sheriff," she said, her gaze dropping to the star on his chest. "Caleb Blackwood." He introduced himself, his voice a low rumble. "It seems you found yourself in a bit of a situation." It was a vast understatement, and they both knew it. "It appears so," she said, her voice strained. "My fiancé, Mr. Croft, seems to have been delayed." Caleb didn't have the heart to tell her that Mr. Croft had likely never existed, at least not in the way she believed. "Town doesn't have a proper hotel," he stated, a practical fact. "Just a few rooms above the saloon. Not a place for a lady." Her chin lifted higher. "I assure you, Sheriff, I'm perfectly capable of—" Her words trailed off as she looked past him, at the rough-hewn buildings, the hardened faces of the men lingering outside the saloon, the sheer, untamed emptiness that stretched to the horizon. She was not capable. She was a songbird in a land of hawks, and she was beginning to understand it. He saw the fight in her, the refusal to surrender to despair, and he felt an unwelcome flicker of admiration. It was the same stubborn grit he saw in the people who made this territory their home. He had not expected to see it in a woman who looked as if she belonged in a drawing room, surrounded by porcelain and lace. "My housekeeper, Martha, keeps a spare room," he heard himself say, the words leaving his mouth before he had fully consented to them. "It's clean, and it's safe. You could stay there until you get your bearings. Or until this Mr. Croft of yours shows up." Her eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face for his angle, his motive. It was a wise instinct in a place like this. He met her gaze directly, letting her see the weary honesty in his own. He was offering help, nothing more. He expected nothing in return. It was his duty, a simple, uncomplicated transaction, or so he told himself. She hesitated for a long moment, a silent battle raging behind her green eyes. Her pride warred with her predicament. Finally, with a nearly imperceptible nod, her pride conceded. "You are very kind, Sheriff Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "My name is Eleanor Vance." "Miss Vance," he acknowledged with a nod. He turned to her trunks. "I'll have these brought over." He lifted one, the leather heavy and solid in his grasp. As he moved it, he misjudged the space between them. The corner of the trunk bumped against her, and she stumbled forward to keep her balance, her gloved hand flying out to steady herself against his chest. The contact was brief, a fleeting moment, but it sent a jolt through him that was as unexpected as a lightning strike from a clear blue sky. Through the thick fabric of his shirt and vest, he could feel the faint warmth of her hand, the delicate pressure of her fingers. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. It had been years since a woman had touched him with anything other than accidental politeness. For a dizzying second, the scent of lavender and old paper, the scent of her, filled his senses, cutting through the familiar smells of dust and leather. It was a scent of another world, a world he had long since abandoned. She pulled her hand back as if burned, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Forgive me, Sheriff. No harm done," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He turned away quickly, hoisting the trunk with more force than necessary, needing the physical strain to chase away the disquieting sensation. He called over a boy lounging nearby, flipped him a coin, and instructed him to fetch the other trunk and follow him to his house at the end of the street. As they walked, a stiff silence fell between them. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, her posture once again ramrod straight, a fortress of propriety. Caleb was intensely aware of her presence beside him, of the faint rustle of her dress, of the way she navigated the uneven boardwalk with a determined grace. His quiet, ordered world had been breached. A woman with moss-green eyes and the scent of lavender was now following him home, and the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart suddenly felt fragile and thin, like weathered wood against a rising storm. He did not want this complication. He did not want this intrusion. But as he glanced at her profile, at the determined set of her jaw, he knew it was already too late. The train had come and gone, and it had left more than just a stranded passenger on a platform. It had left a question in the quiet emptiness of his life. Caleb's house was like the man himself, solid, unadorned, and built to withstand the elements. It was a simple timber frame structure at the edge of town, with a porch that looked out over the endless sagebrush flats. There were no flowers in the yard, only packed earth and a lone, stubborn cottonwood tree that provided a sliver of shade in the brutal summer months. As he led Eleanor up the 2 steps to the porch, the front door opened before he could reach for the handle. Martha stood in the doorway, a formidable woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and hands that looked strong enough to wring a chicken's neck or soothe a fevered brow with equal competence. She had been his late wife's friend and had stayed on after, a silent, watchful presence who managed his house with a fierce efficiency that bordered on tyranny. Her sharp blue eyes took in Eleanor from head to toe, a swift, assessing glance that missed nothing. "Martha," Caleb said, his tone one of gruff respect. "This is Miss Eleanor Vance. She's been stranded. She'll be needing the spare room for a few days." Martha's gaze shifted to Caleb, one eyebrow raised in a silent, eloquent question. He had not brought a guest, let alone an unchaperoned woman. into this house in 5 years. She grunted, a sound that could mean anything from disapproval to acceptance, and stepped back, holding the door open. Supper's in an hour. The room is at the top of the stairs. I trust you can find it. Her voice was as starched as her apron. Thank you, mistress, Eleanor began, her voice polite. Just Martha. The older woman cut her off, turning her attention to the boy depositing the second trunk on the porch. She directed him to carry them upstairs with a pointed finger, leaving no room for argument. Eleanor looked from the housekeeper's retreating back to Caleb, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She seems capable. She's the only person in this territory who isn't afraid of me, Caleb said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for a fraction of a second before vanishing. That makes her invaluable. He gestured toward the stairs. Go on. Get yourself settled. As I said, supper is in an hour. He watched her ascend the stairs, her back straight, her steps light. The house, which had always been a bastion of quiet, masculine solitude, suddenly felt different. Her presence filled the space in a way he hadn't anticipated, a subtle shift in the very air he breathed. He retreated to his study, a small room lined with a few books on law and geology, and poured himself a whiskey. He needed the familiar burn to chase away the unfamiliar stirrings inside him. Dinner was a quiet affair. The three of them sat at the heavy oak table in the kitchen, the only sounds the clinking of silverware against plates and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Martha served a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread, her movements economical and precise. She did not participate in the conversation, but Caleb knew she was listening to every word, every silence. Eleanor, to her credit, did not seem intimidated. After the initial awkwardness, she began to speak, her voice a low, pleasant melody that seemed strangely at home in the rustic kitchen. Philadelphia is very different, she said, responding to a perfunctory question from Caleb about her home. It is a city of brick and stone, of noise and crowds. One can walk for miles and never see the horizon. She paused, looking toward the window, where the last light of day was painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. Here, the sky is everything. It is so vast it feels humbling, almost frightening. It can be, Caleb agreed, his voice quiet. This land demands respect. It doesn't suffer fools gladly. I'm beginning to understand that, she said softly. Her gaze met his across the table. Sheriff, about Mr. Croft, do you truly believe he has just been delayed? The question was direct, stripped of the hopeful pretense she had maintained at the station. She was asking for the truth, no matter how harsh. Caleb took his time answering, swirling the water in his tin cup. He owed her the truth. Miss Vance, he began, choosing his words carefully. I've been the law in this territory for 5 years. I know nearly everyone for 100 miles in any direction. I have never heard the name Silas Croft. And, as I said, there is no new schoolteacher position. Mistress Gable has held that post since the town was founded. He watched the color drain from her face, leaving her pale and fragile-looking in the lamplight. She had known, of course. Some part of her must have known the moment she stepped off that train onto an empty platform. But hearing the words spoken aloud by the sheriff gave them a brutal finality. He saw her swallow hard, her hands tightening in her lap. But she did not cry. Her chin came up, that stubborn pride a shield against the crushing weight of her reality. I see, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then I have been a fool. You've been deceived, Caleb corrected her gently. There's a difference. What did he promise you? A new life, she said, a bitter smile touching her lips. My parents passed away last year. They left me with a small inheritance, enough to be comfortable, but not enough to live on indefinitely without a husband or a profession. Mr. Croft's letters, they were very persuasive. He painted a picture of a vibrant, growing community, of a home, of a purpose. Her voice broke on the last word. He said he had purchased a ranch with my funds, as a surprise for my arrival. I wired him the last of my money 2 weeks ago. The knot in Caleb's stomach tightened into a cold, hard fist of anger. It was worse than he thought. The man had not just broken her heart. He had stolen her future. He was a predator, and he had chosen his victim well. A grieving, isolated woman with a little money and a lot of hope. "I am truly alone," Eleanor stated, not with self-pity, but with a kind of dazed wonder, as if she were trying on the fact for size. "I have no family to return to. I have no funds. I am adrift." In that moment, sitting in his kitchen, her carefully constructed world in ruins around her, Caleb saw a reflection of his own past. He knew what it was to have everything you held dear torn away, to be left standing in the rubble of your life. He had reacted by building walls, by embracing solitude as a penance and a shield. He saw in her a different kind of strength, a fragile resilience that bent but did not break. "My wife, Sarah, and my son, Jacob," he began, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. He had not spoken their names to a stranger in years. Martha stilled, her hands pausing in the act of clearing the plates. Eleanor's eyes, wide and luminous, fixed on his face. "They died. Fever, 6 years ago. Took them both in less than a week." He did not elaborate on the agony of it, the helplessness, the way he had begged a silent God for a mercy that never came. He did not need to. The stark facts were enough. "I had a ranch north of here. A good one. But after, the house was too quiet. The silence was louder than a scream. Every room held a ghost. So I sold it. I came here. I took this job. I wanted something with clear rules. Something that made sense when nothing else did." A profound silence settled over the table. It was a shared space, no longer just a kitchen, but a place where two profound losses met and acknowledged each other. He had offered her his story, his wound, as a strange sort of comfort. He was telling her, without saying the words, that he understood what it was to be adrift. Eleanor reached a hand across the table, her fingers gently touching the back of his. It was not a flirtatious gesture, but one of pure, unvarnished human compassion. Her touch was warm, and once again it sent a shockwave through his carefully guarded system. "I am so sorry, Sheriff Blackwood," she said, her voice thick with genuine empathy. "No one should have to endure such a loss." He pulled his hand away, not out of anger, but out of a deep, instinctual fear. Her sympathy felt dangerous. Her touch felt like a key turning in a lock he had long since rusted shut. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice gruff as he stood up from the table. "You're tired, Miss Vance. You should get some rest. We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." Without another word, he retreated from the kitchen, leaving her with Martha. He went out onto the porch, into the cool night air. The sky was a riot of stars, cold and distant and beautiful. He leaned against the post, the same one he had leaned against that afternoon, and stared out into the darkness. He had invited her into his home to protect her from the dangers of the town. He had not considered that the greatest danger might be to himself, to the hard-won peace of his solitude. By sharing his past, he had opened a door he had sworn to keep sealed forever. And he had a terrible feeling that Eleanor Vance, with her moss-green eyes and her quiet strength, was about to walk right through it. The next morning, Caleb awoke to a foreign sound, the low, humming melody of a woman singing softly to herself. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was dreaming, caught in a memory of a life before. Then he remembered. Eleanor. He dressed quickly and went downstairs to find her in the kitchen, an apron of Martha's tied around her waist, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She was kneading dough on a floured board, her movements surprisingly deft. The room was filled with a warm, comforting scent of yeast and cinnamon. Martha was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in her hands, watching Eleanor with an expression that was a curious mix of suspicion and approval. She insisted. Martha said to Caleb by way of explanation, her tone flat. "So she won't be a charity case." Eleanor looked up, a smudge of flour on her cheek. "Good morning, Sheriff. I hope you do not mind. I find that keeping my hands busy helps to quiet my mind. And I must earn my keep. You are my guest, Miss Vance." "You have nothing to earn," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. Her industry was a quiet reproach to his own inertia. She was already fighting back, refusing to be defined by her circumstances. Nevertheless, she replied, her chin tilting up in that way he was starting to recognize. I will not be idle. It is not in my nature. He poured himself a cup of coffee and watched her work. She was a study in contrasts. The refined posture and articulate speech of a lady from the East, combined with a practical, no-nonsense approach to the task at hand. She was not as fragile as she looked. He had suspected it last night, and he was certain of it now. There was a core of steel beneath that polished exterior. We need to discuss your options, he said, taking a seat at the table. There's a stagecoach that leaves for Cheyenne in 2 days. From there, you could get a train heading back east. She stopped kneading, her hands stilling in the dough. With what funds, Sheriff? I told you, I have nothing. And to what would I return? To be an object of pity and charity for distant relatives? No. She shook her head, a resolute fire in her eyes. I will not go back. I came here for a new life, and though it has started disastrously, I will not be so easily defeated. What do you propose to do? He asked, a touch of skepticism in his voice. This is a hard place, Miss Vance. There aren't many opportunities for a woman on her own. I am an educated woman. I can teach. I can cook. I can sew. Surely there is some work to be found. A governess for a rancher's family, perhaps? Or I could help Mistress Gable at the school. Caleb considered it. She was right. She was not without skills. But a lone, beautiful woman in this territory was a magnet for trouble. Every unmarried ranch hand and cowboy for 50 miles would be at her door. And then there was the matter of Silas Croft. This man, Croft, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. Men like him don't just disappear. If he intended to take your money, he would have done so and vanished. The fact that he lured you all the way out here suggests he wanted more than just the funds you wired him. He wanted you here, in his control, which means he might still be looking for you. A flicker of fear crossed her face, the first he had seen that morning. What do you mean? I mean, you need to be careful. You need to stay put here where I can keep an eye on things until I can get a wire out to the marshals in Cheyenne and see if they have any record of a man matching his description. So, I am to be your prisoner, Sheriff? She asked, her tone sharp. You are to be my guest, he countered, his patience wearing thin. And you will remain so until I am satisfied that you are safe. Is that understood? Their eyes locked in a battle of wills across the kitchen table. The scent of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven filled the air, a strangely domestic backdrop for their tense standoff. Finally, she gave a stiff nod. Understood, Sheriff. I will remain your guest. She turned back to her dough and began to pummel it with a renewed vigor that left little doubt as to whom she was picturing under her fists. Over the next few days, a strange rhythm established itself in the small house. Eleanor proved to be as good as her word. She refused to be idle. She helped Martha with the cooking, the cleaning, the mending. She brought a sense of order and even a touch of beauty to the Spartan home. A jar of wildflowers appeared on the kitchen table. His mending pile, which had been growing to catastrophic proportions, vanished, its contents reappearing in his wardrobe, neatly patched and folded. The house began to feel less like a barracks and more like a home. Caleb found himself watching her constantly. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched a tear in one of his shirts. He listened to her quiet conversations with Martha, their initial frostiness slowly thawing into a grudging respect. He would come home from his patrols to the smell of baking bread or a simmering stew, and the quiet, lonely house would feel, for a moment, alive again. It was a deeply unsettling feeling. It reminded him too much of what he had lost, and it tempted him with the thought of what he might impossibly have again. One evening, he found her on the porch, a book open in her lap, though she was not reading. She was watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of fire and gold. He came and stood near the railing, not speaking for a long time. "It's beautiful," she said at last, her voice soft. "In Philadelphia, we had art galleries with paintings of landscapes like this. I always thought they were exaggerations, but they are not. If anything, they do not capture the sheer scale of it. It has its moments," he conceded. She turned to look at him, her expression serious. "Sheriff, Caleb, I cannot stay here indefinitely. It is not proper, and I am a burden to you. You're not a burden, he said, the words surprising him with their sincerity. And as for what's proper, redemption has its own rules. People will talk, but they always do. Martha is here. Your reputation is safe. It is not just my reputation I am concerned with, she said, her gaze steady. It is my spirit. I need a purpose. I need to stand on my own feet. She closed her book and stood, facing him. I spoke with Mistress Gable today in town. Her eyesight is failing. She admitted she could use an assistant. She cannot pay me much, but it would be a start. It would be something of my own. He felt a surge of protectiveness, hot and unwelcome. I told you to stay put. And I told you I will not be a prisoner, she countered, her eyes flashing. I was careful. I did not go alone. But I will not hide. I will not let that man, that ghost, ruin my life any more than he already has. I will build something new here, with or without your permission. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her face, and he knew he could not stop her. More than that, he did not want to. He admired her fire, her refusal to be cowed. It was the spirit of a pioneer, a spirit he had thought belonged only to the hardened men and women who had been born to this land. He was wrong. All right, he said with a sigh of resignation. You can assist, Mistress Gable, but I'll walk you to and from the schoolhouse every day, and you will not go anywhere else alone. That is not negotiable. A brilliant smile transformed her face, and the effect was like the sun breaking through clouds. Thank you, Caleb. It was the first time she had used his given name, and it sounded startlingly intimate in the quiet twilight. The arrangement began the next week. The walks to the schoolhouse became a part of their daily routine. They were short, only a few hundred yards down the main street, but they became a small, protected space for conversation. She told him about the books she loved, about the philosophy she had studied at the ladies' seminary she attended. She asked him about the land, about the names of the wildflowers that grew in stubborn clumps beside the road, about the habits of the antelope he sometimes saw grazing in the distance. He found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about the geology of the region, about the way the mountains have been formed. He explained the delicate balance of the ecosystem, the relationship between predator and prey. He spoke of things that were solid, factual, and safe. But with every step they took together, he could feel the carefully constructed walls of his solitude crumbling, one stone at a time. He was beginning to look forward to their walks, to the sound of her voice, to the way she looked at the world with a sense of wonder that he had long since lost. One afternoon, as they were walking home, two strangers rode into town. They were rough-looking men, with dusty clothes and hard, watchful eyes. They reined in their horses in front of the saloon and watched Caleb and Eleanor approach. Caleb's hand instinctively dropped to the butt of his Colt Peacemaker. He felt Eleanor tense beside him. "Sheriff," one of the men called out, his voice a gravelly drawl. He dismounted, his spurs jingling with a menacing sound. "We're looking for someone. A man by the name of Silas Croft. Heard he might have passed through here." Caleb kept his expression neutral, his body positioned slightly in front of Eleanor. "What's your business with him?" "He owes our employer some money," the second man said, remaining on his horse. "A substantial amount. We also heard he was traveling with a lady. A fancy piece from back east. You seen anyone like that?" His eyes slid over to Eleanor, a greasy, appraising look that made Caleb's blood run cold. "There's a lady right here," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "But she's under my protection. And the only business you have in this town is to water your horses and move on." The man on the ground chuckled, a humorless sound. "Feisty, ain't he? Look, Sheriff, we don't want no trouble. We just want what's owed. Croft swindled our boss, Mr. Bannon, out of a land deed. And we have reason to believe the lady might know where he is. Or she might have the money he was supposed to pay." "The lady has no money," Caleb stated, his voice flat and final. "And she knows nothing about your Mr. Croft. Now I'm telling you for the last time. Move on." The man's eyes narrowed. He looked from Caleb's unwavering stare to the Colt at his hip, then back to his partner on the horse. He made a calculation. After a long, tense moment, he gave a curt nod. "All right, Sheriff. We'll be on our way." He swung back into his saddle, and without another word, the two men nudged their horses into a walk and continued down the street, heading out of town. Caleb did not relax until there were distant figures shimmering in the afternoon heat. He turned to Eleanor. She was pale, her knuckles white where she gripped her book. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though he could see she was shaken. "They work for another man Croft has cheated? He seems to make a habit of it." "Men like Croft are weeds," Caleb said grimly. "They spread and choke out everything around them." He took her arm, his touch firm and reassuring. "Come on, let's get you home." But as they walked the last few feet to his house, a deep sense of foreboding settled over him. Those men were not the type to give up so easily. They were just the first sign of the storm that was gathering on the horizon. Croft had not just brought his own troubles to redemption. He had drawn a whole new set of dangers with him. And Eleanor, whether she knew it or not, was standing directly in the center of it all. His duty to protect her was no longer just a matter of decency. It had become a visceral, urgent need. The thought of those men putting their hands on her, of that greasy look in their eyes, filled him with a cold, murderous rage that startled him with its intensity. This was no longer about the law. It had become deeply, terrifyingly personal. The arrival of Bannon's men cast a long shadow over the fragile peace they had established. Caleb became a constant, watchful presence. He spent less time in his office and more time within sight of the house or the school. He cleaned his rifle every evening, the methodical, repetitive motion of balm to his frayed nerves. He was a man bracing for a fight, and the tension was a palpable thing in the small house. Eleanor, too, felt the change. The vast, indifferent wilderness that had once seemed beautiful now felt menacing, full of hidden dangers. Every snap of a twig, every distant coyote howl, sent a shiver of fear down her spine. Yet, her fear was tempered by a new, surprising emotion, a profound sense of safety whenever Caleb was near. His quiet strength was a shield, his presence a fortress. She found herself watching him, studying the hard lines of his face, the weary kindness in his eyes, the gentle way he sometimes spoke to his horse. She was seeing the man beneath the badge, the wounded soul who had wrapped himself in duty to keep from falling apart. And her heart, which she had thought irrevocably broken by Croft's betrayal, began to feel a slow, hesitant stirring. One evening, a week after the riders had passed through, the storm finally broke. Caleb had just returned from a final patrol of the town. The sun had set, and a sliver of moon hung in the inky sky. As he approached the house, he noticed something was wrong. The lamp in the front window, which Martha always lit at dusk, was dark. A prickle of unease ran up his spine. He drew his Colt, the familiar weight of it a grim comfort in his hand, and moved toward the house with a silent, practiced tread. He slipped around to the back, his boots making no sound on the packed earth. The kitchen door was slightly ajar. Through the crack, he could hear the low murmur of unfamiliar male voices and a sharp, terrified cry from Martha. Rage, pure and cold, flooded his veins. He kicked the door open, his gun leveled. Two men were in the kitchen. They were not the same men from before. These were harder, more desperate looking. One of them had Martha backed into a corner, a knife held to her throat. The other was holding Eleanor by the arm, twisting it behind her back. She cried out in pain, her face pale with terror. "Let them go." Caleb's voice was a low growl, devoid of all emotion save for a deadly calm. The man holding Eleanor laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The sheriff. Croft said you'd be a problem. He wants the girl. Seems she has something that belongs to him." "She has nothing," Caleb said, his eyes never leaving the man. "And you have 3 seconds to take your hands off her before I kill you where you stand." The man holding Martha pressed the knife harder, and the old woman winced. "You shoot him, she dies. You drop the gun, and maybe we all walk away from this." Caleb was caught in a stalemate. His mind raced, calculating angles, possibilities. He could not risk a shot. He could not risk Martha's life. As he hesitated, the man holding Eleanor saw his chance. He shoved her violently toward Caleb, using her as a shield and a distraction, while drawing his own pistol. It was a fatal miscalculation. He underestimated Eleanor. As she stumbled forward, her eyes wild with fear and adrenaline, she did not simply fall. She reacted. With a cry of fury, she grabbed the heavy iron skillet that was sitting on the stove and swung it with all her might. The pan connected with the man's head with a sickening crack. He grunted in surprise and pain, his eyes rolling back in his head as he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The distraction was all Caleb needed. In that split second, as the second man's attention wavered, Caleb fired. The shot was deafening in the small kitchen. The man holding Martha cried out and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, the knife clattering to the floor. Caleb was on him in an instant, disarming him and slamming him against the wall. Martha, freed, slumped against the counter, gasping for breath but otherwise unharmed. Eleanor stood frozen, the heavy skillet still clutched in her hands, her chest heaving. Her eyes met Caleb's over the chaos, and in them he saw not just terror, but a fierce, blazing strength. She had not been a victim. She had fought back. He tied up the conscious intruder, his movements swift and efficient, his mind already working on the next problem. "Where's Croft?" he demanded, his voice like flint. The man, cradling his wounded shoulder, spat on the floor. "Go to hell." Caleb pressed the barrel of his Colt against the man's temple. "I can send you there first." "Where is he?" Fear finally broke through the man's bravado. "He's at the old abandoned sawmill by the creek," he gasped. "He's waiting for us." He said to bring the girl. Caleb straightened up, his face a grim mask. He turned to Martha. "Take my horse. Ride to the livery. Get a few of the men from the council. Tell them to meet me at the sawmill. Tell them to come armed and come quiet." Martha nodded, her face pale but resolute, and hurried out the door. Caleb then turned to Eleanor. He gently took the skillet from her trembling hands and set it on the table. He took her by the shoulders, his grip firm, forcing her to look at him. "Eleanor, are you hurt?" She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the smudge of grime on her cheek. "No, I'm all right. I need you to be brave for a little while longer," he said, his voice softer now, urgent. "I have to go after him. I can't leave him out there, a snake in the grass. He'll just come back." "You can't go alone," she whispered, her hands coming up to grip his arms. "It's a trap. The men from town will be behind me," he assured her, though he knew he would likely arrive long before them. He could not wait. The thought of Croft, the man who had done this to her, being so close, filled him with a burning need for resolution. "I need you to stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes wide and full of a fear that was entirely for him. He saw it plain as day, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. In that moment, he understood the true depth of his own feelings. This was not about duty. This was not about protection. He was in love with her. The realization was as terrifying as it was absolute. It was the one thing he had sworn he would never feel again, the one vulnerability he could not afford. He could not afford to think about it now. He released her, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second on her arms. "Bar the door," he repeated, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. He ran from the house, leaving her silhouetted in the doorway, a lone, brave figure in the encroaching darkness. He vaulted onto the back of the intruder's horse and spurred it into a gallop, the wind whipping at his face as he rode toward the sawmill, toward a confrontation that would either end this threat for good or destroy the fragile new world that was just beginning to take shape around him. The old sawmill stood skeletal against the moonlit sky, a place of long shadows and decaying memories. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the rushing of the nearby creek. Caleb dismounted 100 yards out, tethering the horse to a low-hanging branch. He moved forward on foot, his rifle now in his hands, his senses on high alert. The place was an ambush waiting to happen, a maze of stacked lumber and rusting machinery. He circled around the main building, using the deep shadows for cover. A faint flicker of light from a broken window told him where to find his quarry. He crept closer, his movements as silent as a predator's. Peering through the grimy pane of glass, he saw him. Silas Croft. He was not what Caleb had expected. He was not a hulking brute, but a man of medium build, dressed in clothes that were a little too fine for this part of the country. He was pacing back and forth in front of a sputtering lantern, his movements agitated, like a caged animal. Caleb saw his chance. Croft was alone, his hired men either captured or, Caleb hoped, on their way to meet the posse Martha had raised. He kicked the door in, the rotting wood splintering with a loud crack. "Croft!" Silas spun around, his hand flying to a pistol tucked into his waistband. His face was pale in the lantern light, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and arrogance. "Sheriff, I should have known my men were incompetent." "It's over," Caleb said, his rifle steady. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and fraud." Croft laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Arrest? Don't be absurd. This is a simple misunderstanding. A business arrangement that went sour. The woman, Eleanor, she owes me." "She owes you nothing," Caleb growled. "You preyed on a grieving woman, stole her money, and lured her into a trap. Men have been hanged for less." "She was a means to an end," Croft sneered, his fear giving way to a desperate bravado. "Her father was a wealthy man. I was led to believe her inheritance was far greater. When I discovered it was a mere pittance, I had to adjust my plans. But she still has value. A woman like that, she'd fetch a high price in the mining camps." A red haze of fury descended over Caleb. The casual cruelty, the utter lack of humanity in the man's words, snapped the last thread of his professional restraint. He took a step forward, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. It was the opening Croft was waiting for. He fired his pistol, the shot echoing like a thunderclap in the cavernous space. The bullet whizzed past Caleb's ear, close enough to feel the heat of its passage. Caleb dove for cover behind a stack of lumber as another shot splintered the wood where he had just been standing. He returned fire, his shot aimed not to kill, but to disable. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Croft's arm, and the man cried out, dropping his pistol. Caleb was on his feet, closing the distance. But Croft was quicker than he looked. He scrambled away, kicking over the lantern as he went. The oil spilled across the dry, sawdust-covered floor and ignited instantly. A wall of flame erupted between them, casting flickering, demonic shadows across the mill. "You'll never take me, Sheriff!" Croft screamed, his voice filled with panicked rage, as he scrambled toward a back exit. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, licking up the dry wooden walls, the roar of it growing louder by the second. The entire structure would be an inferno in minutes. Caleb knew he had a choice: pursue Croft into the darkness or get out before the roof collapsed. The thought of letting the man escape was galling, but his own life, the life he was just beginning to realize he wanted to live, was more important. He turned and ran for the main entrance, the heat of the fire a scorching beast at his back. He burst out into the cool night air, coughing, his lungs full of smoke, just as the posse of townsmen arrived, their faces grim in the flickering firelight. He went out the back. Caleb yelled, pointing, "He's wounded." The men fanned out, their lanterns bobbing in the darkness as they began the search. Caleb leaned against a tree, catching his breath, watching the sawmill burn. It was a funeral pyre for his old life, for the solitude and the emptiness. He had faced death, and in doing so, he had been overcome by an overwhelming desire to live, to truly live. And that life, he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, included Eleanor. He did not wait for the posse to find Croft. He knew they would. He turned and began to walk back to town, his long strides eating up the distance. He had to get back to her. He had to tell her. Nothing else mattered. When he reached the house, he saw her waiting on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, a lone figure silhouetted against the faint light from within. She had not barred the door. She had been waiting for him. As he approached, she ran down the steps and met him in the yard. "Caleb!" she cried, her voice choked with relief. She threw her arms around his neck, holding on to him as if she would never let go. "I was so worried. I saw the fire." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of lavender and smoke. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart against his chest, or maybe it was his own. In that moment, the last of his defenses crumbled into dust. The fortress he had built around his heart was gone, and in its place was a feeling so powerful, so overwhelming, it left him breathless. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "He's gone. You're safe." She pulled back slightly, her hands framing his face, her eyes searching his in the dim light. "Are you all right? You're not hurt." "I'm fine," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He looked at her, at the fierce, beautiful, courageous woman who had turned his world upside down. He thought of his vow of solitude, of his belief that love was a weakness. How wrong he had been. Loving her, protecting her, had made him feel more alive, more powerful than he had in years. It was not a weakness. It was the ultimate strength. "Eleanor," he began, his voice cracking, "when I was in that fire, when I thought I might not make it out, the only thing I could think about was you. I was a fool. I spent 5 years building walls to keep the world out, to keep feeling out. I thought surviving was the same as living. It's not." Tears welled in her eyes, shimmering in the moonlight. "Caleb, I love you," he said, the words a raw, honest confession torn from the deepest part of his soul. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stepped off that train. You, with your stubborn pride and your courage and your ridiculous Eastern dress. You walked into my quiet, empty life and you filled it with light. And I don't want to live without that light ever again." A sob escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "Oh, Caleb, I love you too." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss full of desperation and relief, of promises made and a future claimed. It was the kiss of a man coming home after a long, lonely journey. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cupping her face. He saw his future in her eyes, a future filled with warmth and laughter and life. He thought of the small, tarnished silver ring that had belonged to his grandmother, tucked away in a box in his desk. It was a relic of his past, a past he had tried to bury. But now he saw it differently. It was not an anchor to his grief, but a link in a chain, a connection to a future he wanted to build with her. "Marry me, Eleanor," he whispered, the words both a question and a prayer. "Be my wife. Build a life with me here in this wild, beautiful, terrible place." "Yes," she breathed, her answer immediate and certain. "Oh yes, Caleb, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her again, a slow, deep kiss that sealed their promise under the vast, star-dusted Wyoming sky. The fire in the distance was dying down, its angry red glow softening to a gentle ember. A new day was coming. For the first time in a very long time, Caleb Blackwood was not afraid to face the dawn. The posse caught up with Silas Croft 2 miles down the creek bed, his wounded arm having slowed him considerably. He surrendered without a fight, his arrogance replaced by the pathetic whining of a coward. He was brought back to redemption and locked in the town jail, the solid iron bars a stark contrast to the flimsy promises he had built his life upon. The circuit judge, when he arrived a month later, was not a man known for his leniency. Croft was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor, a fate that ensured he would never trouble anyone again. The other men, Bannon's hired guns, were run out of the territory with a stern warning from Caleb that their return would be met with swift and permanent consequences. With the external threat gone, a new sense of peace settled over the small town, and particularly over the sheriff's house. The news of Caleb and Eleanor's impending marriage spread through redemption like a summer wildfire. There was gossip, of course. Tongues wagged over the speed of the courtship, over the unusual circumstances of their meeting. But beneath the talk, there was a current of genuine happiness for the sheriff. The town had watched him walk through the years like a ghost, a man haunted by a past he could not escape. To see the light back in his eyes, to hear the rare sound of his laughter as he walked with his intended bride, was a welcome sight. The community, which had been wary of the elegant woman from the East, now embraced her. When they saw her working alongside Martha, her hands covered in flour, or patiently sounding out words with the youngest students at the schoolhouse, they saw not a fragile outsider, but a woman of substance and grit. They saw the same stubborn spirit that had led them all to this unforgiving land. They saw a survivor. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the town's small, unadorned church. The entire population of Redemption seemed to be in attendance. Eleanor wore a simple cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, and in her hair, she wore a crown of the same wildflowers she had once placed in a jar on Caleb's kitchen table. Caleb stood at the altar, his sheriff's star pinned to a new black coat, his gaze fixed on her as she walked down the aisle on the arm of a proud Jebediah, the station master. When he slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger, it was not a somber moment of remembrance, but a joyful act of continuation. He was not replacing his past, but honoring it by building a new future. As the preacher pronounced them man and wife, a cheer went up in the small church. Martha, standing in the front pew, was seen to wipe a tear from her eye with the corner of her apron, a rare crack in her formidable facade. They did not stay in the small house in town. Caleb had never truly sold his old ranch. He had leased the land to a neighbor, unable to part with the place where he had buried his first family. With Eleanor by his side, he found the courage to return. Together, they walked the land, his hand holding hers. He showed her the spot on a rise, marked by two simple wooden crosses. She did not shy away, but stood beside him in silent respect, her presence a comforting warmth against the lingering chill of his grief. "This is not a place of sadness anymore, Caleb," she told him, her voice soft but sure. "It is a place of memory. We will build our life here, and we will fill this land with so much new laughter and new love that the echoes of the old sorrows will fade." And so they did. With the help of their neighbors, they began to rebuild. They repaired the old ranch house, adding new rooms, expanding the windows to let in the light. Eleanor planted a garden, and soon, vibrant flowers bloomed where only sagebrush had grown before. The silence of the house was broken by the sounds of hammering, of conversation, of Eleanor singing softly as she worked. Caleb bought back his cattle, and the ranch, once a place of ghosts, became a place of life and purpose once more. He resigned as sheriff, passing the star to a worthy deputy, and dedicated himself fully to the land and to his wife. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the valley. The ranch was thriving, a testament to their hard work and shared dreams. The house was no longer a simple cabin, but a warm, sprawling home, with a wide porch that looked out over green pastures and contented cattle. Laughter, bright and clear as a mountain stream, echoed in the yard. Caleb leaned against a newly mended section of the fence, watching his family. Eleanor sat on a blanket under the shade of the large cottonwood tree, her belly swollen with the promise of their second child. At her feet, a small boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes toddled on unsteady legs, chasing a butterfly. Their son, Samuel. He pushed himself off the fence and walked toward them, his heart full of a quiet, profound peace he had once believed was lost to him forever. He sat down on a blanket beside Eleanor, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. Samuel, abandoning his butterfly hunt, crawled into his father's lap, babbling happily. "He's getting so big," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a gentle wonder. "It seems like only yesterday you were bringing me home, a terrified stranger." "You were never terrified," Caleb corrected her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "You were the bravest woman I had ever met. You just didn't know it yet." He looked out at the land, at the life they had built from the ashes of their pasts. He thought of the man he had been, a man locked in a prison of his own making, waiting for nothing. He turned to look at her, his eyes full of a love that had only deepened with time. He gently brushed a stray strand of honey-blonde hair from her face. "You know," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "That day at the station when I saw you standing there, all alone, I wasn't supposed to help you. I wasn't supposed to get involved. I was supposed to just keep walking. You weren't supposed to wait for me to come to my senses. He paused, a small, genuine smile touching his lips as he looked from his wife to his son. But I'm glad you did. Eleanor smiled, a beautiful, radiant expression that still made his heart ache with love. She leaned in and kissed him, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of sunshine and home. So am I. Caleb, she whispered against his lips. So am I.